Welcome, everybody. My name is Greg Brzezinski. I'm a professor of history and international affairs in the Elliott School, and I am the deputy director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies. Welcome to the first Korea Policy Forum of the year. The title or the subject for our forum is going to be U.S. China Strategic Rivalry and U.S. South Korean Cooperation after the Moon Biden Summit. A topic which I'm sure is very much on everybody's mind now as rivalry with China continues to escalate and the United States struggles to find what kind of relationship it wants with its allies in the region. Today's policy forum is co-sponsored by the GW Institute for Korean Studies and the East Asia National Resource Center at GW. GW is actually the only institution in the DC area to have its own Institute for Korean Studies and to have its own East Asia NRC. Both of those are reasons why GW is one of the best places, if not the best place, to study East Asia in the country. I just want to introduce these two institutes briefly. Our GW Institute for Korean Studies aims to promote knowledge about and study of Korea in the Washington, D.C. region and tries to create greater dialogue between policymakers and people in the academic community, whereas the East Asia's NRC's goal is to broaden our knowledge of East Asia through outreach and a variety of other programs. So for today's forum, we're going to be dividing it into two panels. The first panel is going to cover the diplomatic and security implications of China-U.S. strategic rivalry. That will go for about 30 minutes. And the second panel will cover trade and technology competition and how that impacts U.S. South Korean relations. I also want to mention that if you have questions, there is a Q&A box. We will be taking questions from the audience during the last 25 or 30 minutes, and I will be constantly monitoring the Q&A box. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and remember, don't put it in the chat. The Q&A box is something I can see, and I will use that to ask questions for the audience. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the two speakers who are going to be on our first panel on diplomatic and security implications. The first is Professor Hyunwook Kim, who is a professor and director general at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. He has done a lot of significant research on the U.S.-South Korean alliance, U.S. DPRK relations, and Northeast Asian security, and he was an advisory member for the National Security Council and Ministry of Unification. The second panelist for the first panel is my distinguished colleague, Professor Robert Sutter, who is a professor of practice in international affairs at the Elliott School of the George Washington University, and he's been with us for a little bit over a decade now. He's also served as director of the undergraduate program and has held a number of roles both in academia and government service, and most impressively is the author or co-author of 22 books about China and U.S. Asian relations. So let me turn it over to Professor Kim.
Okay, thank you, Professor Brzezinski. Well, I was expecting Professor Sutter to be the first presenter because he's such a renowned scholar, and his research is about the U.S.-China relations. But well, I'll just speak briefly as has been devised to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. Let me just speak first about what I think, South Korea or other allies perspective about the U.S.-China policies. Briefly about that, and the second part of my presentation will be about U.S.-South Korea alliance after the summit meeting. I think first Allies' view on U.S. China policy. First, I think the Biden government, is focusing on restoring U.S. hegemony based upon liberal international order. There have been some discussions inside the United States about the possibility of the U.S. Taking hegemony, or just focusing on the very narrow U.S. national interests. These two different theoretical debates about U.S. hegemony has been pretty much manifested by the policies of Trump and Biden. But I think at least if the U.S. wants to still be maintained as remain as a hegemon, liberal international order is the cheapest way for the United States to maintain hegemony. Secondly, I'm still wondering what is the objective of Biden's China policy, if that's not the same as Clinton's or Trump's China policies. We all know that the U.S. wanted to change Chinese economic system and change Chinese political system. Trump also wanted to change Chinese, Communist Party. But I think Biden is different. Biden admits that there is a strongly tied interdependence, economic interdependence between U.S. and China, which is why it's not almost impossible. It's not almost possible for the United States to change the Chinese regime. So maybe competitive coexistence is something that Biden is targeting as China policy goal. But still, there is some debate about whether this is really a proper objective. Can this China policy objective be successful? Third part is that allies are still wondering whether democratic value is a viable means for the United States to bring allies and partners to deal with China. Maybe Anglo-Saxon countries like AUKUS, but the value itself is very, unclear means from the allies' perspective. I think in order for the hegemon to get coalitions with allies, I think two ways. First, it should be able to provide public goods to allies and partners, or second, it should be able to display its power, for example, over China. But I don't think these two things are not visible from the United Nations. Even very U.S. has developed a very good vaccines, Pfizer and more, and Moderna. But I was expecting maybe the U.S. has a good opportunity to use those vaccines as a good public goods to international community, to restore and solidify its status as hegemon. But I don't really see that happening now. Lastly, still, I think, still, I don't think Biden is doing something effective to deal with China. There are a lot of preparations, a lot of voices, but what's going on? I mean, allies want the U.S. to take some specific actions so that they can gather together with the United States to deal with China. Second part about the U.S.-South Korea alliance, just to make the three brief points. First, this May 2021 summit meeting between U.S. and South Korea was a very meaningful one. U.S. and South Korea alliance itself was targeting North Korea threats traditionally during the Cold War period, and even after the end of Cold War, the alliance was targeting North Korea. But recently, things were changing. The current South Korean Moon Jae-in government is more trying to see North Korea as a partner to talk to deal with, rather than threats. And the U.S. is now recently trying to use the U.S.-South Korea alliance not to deal with North Korea, but more to deal with China. So these two different moves on the side of the United States, on the side of South Korea, is making alliance a little bit, unsmooth. but I think this May 2020, 2021 summit meeting was very meaningful because this has made two countries to gather together on a specific strategic objective, which is to deal with China. Of course, there was North Korea issues there too. Maybe two countries, summit, two presidents got along and they agreed to deal with North Korea and China altogether. North Korea issue was pretty much, geared towards a dialogue and much more engagement prone ways, and also China issues. Two countries get, agreed upon many things: peace and stability of Taiwan Strait. Many agreements about the issues like technology, climate change, and health issues. So in this zero-sum U.S.-China rivalry, I think South Korea finally made a choice to be on the side of the United States over China, which has not happened before. South Korea always, been very ambivalent and strategically unclear in its choices whenever U.S.-China competition happened. Secondly, then what is the red line when South Korea and China, South Korea and the United States want to get along to deal with China? What would be the red line? Chinese experts and government repeatedly mentioned that the red line is military issues. When THAAD deployment was there, China sanctioned South Korea economically because the military issues, military threat by the U.S. and South Korea against China was what China mentioned mentioned a red line. If other issue area cooperation is fine, of course they don't like it. China doesn't like it, but that's tolerable. But when South Korea and the United States cooperate in military terms against China, that's something that crosses the red line according to China. But recently, surprisingly, in June and July, South Korea participated in military exercises. Talisman Sabre in Australia, with New Zealand, Canada, England, Japan, and also Pacific Vanguard in July with Australia, Japan, and the United States. So I think this is something that South Korea is slowly, may low-key, but crossing the red line. I'm just wondering what would be the Chinese reactions. Maybe now many countries are gathering together to deal with China, so maybe South Korea is not the only one. Not easy to sanction South Korea, but we can not just exclude the possibility that the U.S. would, China would sanction South Korea as it did to Australia. So what is the ways that South Korea can deal with economic sanctions by China on South Korea? Recently, Australian coal export to China has been banned, but China is just struggling because they lack of coal inside China. So that kind of ways we can deal with Chinese sanctions is possible. Maybe we can use semiconductors exported to China. What if we cut off the semiconductor exports to China when there is some export coercion by China on South Korea? Those are things that comes up to my mind. Lastly, very fundamental question: is China a threat to South Korea? We've been thinking North Korea is a threat for a long time, but maybe it's time for us to think about whether China is a threat to South Korea or not. South Korea or the Korean Peninsula is located at the end of the Chinese continent. Geographically, we belong to Chinese continent. But the systems, political system, values, we are all, resembling and sharing with the United States. So that's the dilemma of South Korea. That's the dilemma of the Korean Peninsula. We still want to maintain the values of the United States and the market systems and democracy. But as time goes by, I think the Chinese influence will be expanded to the Korean Peninsula. then what can we deal with it? How can we deal with it? I think the U.S. South Korea alliance, I think in this sense is something pivotal for South Korea to prevent the expansion of Chinese influence into the entire peninsula. I'll stop here and I'll ask more questions if there are any later. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Bob.
Thanks very much. I'm really happy to be part of this panel and working with Professor Kim. His presentation raises a whole bunch of issues that we need to think about in dealing with the situation. I'm going to give an American perspective on a number of these questions, but I won't cover them all because there's so many that were raised that it's going to be difficult to do that. I just want to look at from the American perspective here in Washington. I think the summit went very well. I agree with Professor Kim on that. I think this was these forward movements, and his mention of the exercises is very good. He could have mentioned cooperation on supply chains, digital supply chains, and other things that South Korea has been doing that were out of the pattern of the recent past. And that pattern of the recent past is a bit disturbing to a lot of American observers. Victor Cha, who's an authoritative voice on U.S. Korean relations, wrote a piece at the end of last year in which he did a chart of where the South Korean government positions itself in hedging vis-a-vis the United States and China. And he found only a few instances where the South Korean government was hedging toward the United States. It was mainly hedging toward China. And he viewed this as troubling. And so I think this is something that's fairly widely held, that this is happening, that allies like South Korea are caught in the middle. And they have a hard time dealing with China because China punishes them. The United States might do things to South Korea, but it probably won't punish them the way the Chinese punish them. And so this is something there are many other differences as well. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. And it's important because the question of what is U.S. China policy, that's a very good question. It's obvious there is not one. It's a work in progress. And this is going to take time. But what is actually happening? I think you can see what is actually happening. China is seen as a fundamental danger to the United States for security reasons, particularly the balance of power in Asia, for economic reasons, particularly competition in high technology and industries. If China dominates, they will dominate the United States, and in governance issues. And these are widespread as well. And this gets into the values issues, which Professor Kim mentioned. The United States is very concerned about this, and this administration is very concerned about this as well. So these are the three challenges driving America. What America is doing, what the government seems to be doing, is responding, trying to find ways to deal with those challenges. So what is the end game? What is the broad pattern? I don't think we can determine that yet. What we can determine is, are they actually doing things to deal with these issues? And I think that, and so what I would see is what the U.S. is fundamentally doing is changing itself domestically. All of these domestic laws that deal with China, the very tens of billions of dollars that's going to go into innovative research, for example, to compete with China, to strengthen the U.S. economy. This large expenditure of money is going through the Congress, and it's very important. And that really comes first for the United States and this administration. Domestic recovery is most important for them, and foreign policy is second. So this is, but then you look at the various efforts that have been going on, the Quad efforts. These are significant, including vaccines. I think you downgrade the vaccine importance for the United States government a little bit too much, I think. It's having difficulty, but I think that they're committed to doing this. And then the agreement with the UK and Australia is just a high point here. But then you have this work on securing digital economy, supply chains, and working in the UN elsewhere to counter China's challenges. And what does the US want? What does the US government want from its allies and partners? It wants them to help. And it varies, obviously, in the willingness of countries to help. Australia obviously is very much willing to do all sorts of things with the United States, as is the UK. That was not the case 2 or 3 years ago, not at all. This is quite a big change for both of these governments. The European allies, in several respects, are willing to do more. They're just moving more in this direction. And it's a values issues as well as an economic issue, as well as security issue. It's all three. They're all together with them. And then we have countries like South Korea. It's really caught in the middle, and it's not big. And China really looms large, and China intimidates them. That's basically what they do. They intimidate them. But South Korea has been willing to take some steps, as was indicated. This is significant. I thought the exercise with Australia and the US was particularly significant because the Chinese don't like that exercise. They've criticized it. And so this is a military demand. And it wasn't just a ship. This was a fairly substantial commitment of the South Korean forces. And so this leads me to the situation that has South Korea ended the hedging approach that Victor Cha talked about, that they're on the fence and they're ever more dependent on China, and they are not willing to take the risk of moving toward the United States in a way that would be offensive to China. And that's something the United States is really dealing with in Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, the so-called allies of Philippines and Thailand are excellent examples of this. And where Southeast Asia over the last 10 years has just moved into China's orbit. And the US is really trying hard now to counter that. South Korea isn't in that situation, but will it move into that situation? That's the dynamic that you see. That's China's plan. That's how they're doing this thing. They gradually intimidate, they gradually erode, and they gradually dominate. And this is what they're doing in Southeast Asia. That's fairly clear. And so the administration is working very hard to counter that in Southeast Asia and compete with China. And in Korea, I think they're very interested in seeing how far the Koreans will go in working with the United States to counter China's challenges. And as I said, there are 3 dimensions of the challenges. They can be counted in various areas, but they're very serious. The US government sees them as very serious. So looking out, what I would say is that what you're going to see is advances by countries like Australia, India, and Japan, the Quad powers, to do things that counter China in various ways. And some of it will be subtle, some of it will be explicit, but it will obviously counter China. Will South Korea join? Or the Europeans will also do things to help the United States. Will South Korea join? That'll be the case. That'll be what individuals will watch. This is very perhaps short-sighted. Obviously, US commitment to Korea, US stake in Korea is enormous. It's not going to disregard this by any means. But the point is, that's the edge that's going on now as far as competition with China is concerned. This competition with China, and Professor Kim and I have talked about this in the past, in my view, will endure. It will endure. It's not something that's going to go away. The Congress just reflects this so well. In this bipartisan support for this kind of approach is very, very strong. So while we watch this future, see how the South Koreans position themselves, there are other uncertainty. And the biggest uncertainty, I think, right now is, will Mr. Biden get his program through the Congress? If he doesn't, I think he will be a very weak president. I think this will change the dynamic in American foreign policy significantly. And what it means for China, I don't think it will diminish American antagonism toward China, because of what I talked about in the Congress and the Republican Party is tougher on this than Mr. Biden. And Mr. Biden's pretty tough he's very tough on China. What he says on China is very strong now. He wasn't a year ago, but he is now. And his people are this way as well. So this is a remarkable change in his part. And I think it's part of this congressional bilateral agreement that the danger is there. These 3 dangers are there, and you have to deal with it. And so this is the point I would raise, is just looking out. If he is weakened, what does this mean? What will the U.S. then want? I'm not sure. I do think that the China opposition will continue. And I do think that it could have to accommodate various tougher measures supported by Republicans who are close to Mr. Trump. And Donald Trump has positioned himself as very critical of China these days. And so this is likely to continue, but probably from a vantage point of a weaker president. So I would watch if I were in South Korea, I'd be watching very closely what's going to happen with this legislation at the in calendar 2021. Because if he fails, if Biden fails and the infrastructure program fails and the $3.5 billion society and economic measures fail, I think this will be a real blow. And the infrastructure is a very anti-China type of program. It's very much focused on the China challenge. So those are my comments, and so there's a lot to talk about, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yes, thank you, Bob and Hyunwook. Those were both excellent presentations. We're pushing I don't want to take too much time away from the next panel, but I actually have one or two questions that I want to ask to sort of push you guys a little bit further. I think you talked about, Hyunwook talked about the South Korean perspective. Bob, you talked about what's going on in the U.S., but I wonder if either of you could speak about how does China see South Korea? What does China have any strategy towards South Korea? Because as I look at it, China's policy towards South Korea doesn't look particularly coherent either. I mean, there is some sense that, China doesn't want South Korea to move too closely to the United States, but to what degree is China willing to risk inflaming opinion in South Korea, in turning South Korea and pushing South Korea closer to the United States and further away from China? Because right now, as I see it, that's what China is doing. But I'd love to hear from the two of you on that point.
I'll defer to Professor Kim. You should go first.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Professor. You're asking such a tough question, Professor Brzezinski. I think something changed abruptly ever since Xi Jinping came in. Before Xi Jinping, Chinese position was to become a hegemon in East Asia. Of course, there was Beijing Olympic in 2008, and ever since China began to attempt to have an equal relationship with the United States, but still, Xi Jinping came in, and China tried to position itself more as a global power. What happened afterwards was to make the entire Korean Peninsula as a buffer state to China rather than only North Korea. Before, North Korea was a very important buffer state to China vis-a-vis the United States, but after Xi Jinping came in, China began to regard the entire Korean Peninsula as a buffer vis-a-vis the United States. So that's why Chinese sanctions and pressure on South Korea became serious whenever there was more and more cooperation between South Korea and the United States. That deployment was one of the big examples. After that deployment, there was economic sanctions, and that made the South Korea to be more and more intimidated about further Chinese sanctions on South Korea. But now things are a little bit different because all the countries centering around the United States is now trying to pressure China, coalitioning each other. And South Korea is now, as Professor Sutton mentioned, taking rather, equivocal positions. But still, first, if China sanctions South Korea one more time, China knows that South Korea would stick into the U.S. side very, adamantly. And secondly, after economic sanctions, after that deployment, the public opinion in South Korea is really dire. More than 75% of South Koreans are really negative about China. And China knows that. So very careful about another economic sanctions, which will possibly ruin the South Korea-China relationships, maybe to the level not easily to be reverted back to normal. So that's what I can say. Thank you.
Yeah, just quickly, Greg, to answer you, I agree with Professor Kim. Excellent presentation. China has been following this carrot and sticks approach toward the neighbors, all of them, and they don't make sense. I mean, because they talk about the carrots and yet they apply the sticks, and so it's contradictory in many respects, but it works in a lot of places. And it's worked in Southeast Asia in general. And so those countries are subjected to this carrots and sticks. They know it, and they're very careful, even though the Chinese keep applying the sticks. So it works there. Will it work in India? Will it work in Japan? They've obviously applied it to both, and it hasn't worked so well in both of those places. And where South Korea would turn up on this issue and how the Chinese think about that, I'll defer to Professor Kim because I don't really know. I think these elements are there. This is Xi Jinping's trademark of backing up what he says with clout and implying it. And so this is so it remains to be seen in my judgment. But I think the pattern that you see in Southeast Asia shows those countries moving into China's orbit. Of course, Southeast Asia has a lot of corruption, and so that can win over the leaders in lots of ways. South Korea doesn't have that kind of thing, and so the influence efforts can't be as salient as they can in places like Malaysia or Myanmar or Cambodia or so forth. And public opinion in South Korea is very negative toward China, but it's negative toward China in Vietnam, and Vietnam is not taking a risk in confronting China. So this is so anyway, it's useful to look at that pattern to get a sense of, well, what will happen in South Korea. I think it's in play. I don't really know which way it's going to go, but those are the patterns.
Okay, thank you very much for those responses. And I think, a lot of what you were talking about, Bob, and these efforts to put pressure on other countries in the region and use carrots and sticks. I do personally think South Korea looks a little bit different than Southeast Asia, at least from the perspective of an American who works on South Korea. I think one of the interesting things is that China is so threatened by South Korean popular culture. So they've been, putting bans on BTS and other popular South Korean groups, and it's actually really starting to have a lot of negative ramifications for the image of China in South Korea. As I look at it, China mishandled this terribly, because 2 years ago, if you ask South Koreans which country in East Asia they were most they had the greatest animosity towards, I think many would have said Japan. But recently, China has greatly surpassed Japan as the country that most South Koreans have seen as a threat. And it's happened in about 2 years. So to me, that doesn't really speak, that doesn't really say a great deal about the skillfulness of Chinese diplomacy on some of these issues. But I also understand, I think, Bob, you made a good point that there's a distinction between sort of public opinion and what risks the countries will actually take when it comes to alienating China. So, very interesting points. Okay. All right. Very good then. So the next panel of this forum, and I do see questions in the Q&A box. I saw, 1 or 2 really good questions. I do hope to get to them after the second panel. I just want to make sure we have time for our second panelists to speak. The next panel is going to cover trade and technology issues. And our 2 speakers are going to be first, Professor Hyo-young Lee, and I'm giving the guests the right to speak first and our own faculty second. Apologies to Hyunwook if you thought I changed the order up on you. But Professor Lee is currently an assistant professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, and she teaches about international trade and diplomacy. Before joining the KNDA in March of 2017, she worked as a research fellow at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy and its Division of International Trade. The second panelist is going to be one of my colleagues at the Elliott School, Professor Stephen Kaplan, who is an associate professor of political science and international affairs at GW and is also a faculty affiliate of the Institute for International Economic Policy and a distinguished expert on political economy. So let me turn it over to Hyo-young.
Yes, thank you. I'm Hyo-young Lee from KNDA. I'm actually very honored to be invited to speak with this very distinguished gathering of experts. I'd like to share my views with you on three major areas for U.S. Korea cooperation from the trade and technology perspective. Let me first begin by providing you with my views on the most important aspects of current U.S. trade policy, if you can call that, or maybe it would be better to call it foreign economic policy, since now trade does not seem to be a main policy tool for the Biden administration at the moment. Since the Biden administration came into office, there has been continuous development and announcement of policy measures or directions that seem to be basically aimed at addressing China more effectively. And from our perspective, the most prominent of those policies seems to be the supply chain reform initiative, which was brought to the surface in February this year, as soon as the Biden administration came into office. So as you all know, the Executive Order 14107 on America's supply chains has ordered the administration to review key American supply chains on 4 key sectors, which are important for America's resilience, namely semiconductors and the batteries for electric vehicles, critical materials, which are key elements for ICT products, and medical goods, which are important for combating health security issues. So among all these areas, the area which Korea is more interested in in terms of cooperation with the US is the area of semiconductors, since Biden has, the administration has pinpointed that it requires a lot of cooperation with partner countries in order to provide the resilience that is needed for the supply chains. So according to the report that was published by the US government, it points that while the US has the skills for the R&D and the value-added areas along the semiconductor manufacturing supply chain, it actually seriously lacks the manufacturing capacity, especially for the high-end small-size chips, which are mostly developed by countries like Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. Therefore, in addition to the need for building up the domestic manufacturing and innovative capability, the US government places a lot of emphasis on working with the allied parties, partners, to compensate for this lacking manufacturing capacity. So this is obviously an area where Korea has a lot of work to do with the US. Several Korean companies have already made promises to make large investments in the US in the semiconductor production facilities, which were made at the sidelines of the US-Korea bilateral summit. A second area which I believe would be an area for cooperation between the two countries is infrastructure, as Professor Brzezinski has mentioned. The Biden administration, also as Professor Sutter has mentioned, appears to be giving a lot of focus on infrastructure, not only for rebuilding the US economy and creating jobs domestically, but also on the international front as well. As you all know, the US government has announced the Build Back Better World, the B3W partnership initiative, which was announced more recently in June. And this aims to provide support for meeting the needs for a more sustainable and transparent infrastructure, especially for the developing countries. not only in the Indo-Pacific region, but also in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean regions. So as you all know, it is basically aimed at providing an alternative to the Chinese BRI, and it is an upgrade to the former Blue Dot initiative, which was pursued by the previous administration. And the focus seems to be on 4 pillars, which are namely the climate and environment issues, health security, digital technology, and gender and equality. So although concrete plans are yet to be announced, this initiative appears to be so far the most advanced form that actually provides the basic framework under which allied countries could join forces with the U.S. to shape the future international economic order, which would be based on trust, democratic values, openness, and transparency. So therefore, this would be another area for Korea to work with the U.S. However, the problem would be that, as emphasized by the Biden administration since the start of office, there are high standards for environment and labor that are required for the partner countries to comply with in order to participate in these global infrastructure projects. So these are areas which Korean companies would have to work on in the future in order to comply with these standards. And lastly, it is very interesting to note that digital technology is incorporated under the B3W Partnership Initiative. Since the USTR hinted in July that the US government has interest in pursuing a digital trade deal with the Asia Pacific region. This is interesting because those of you who are interested will note that in the early months of the Biden administration, the US had suggested that it would only work on domestic economic issues first and putting trade agreements on the back burner until probably the midterm elections. So this also implied that the US would not consider joining the CPTPP anytime soon. Because since any move to join the CPTPP would have to accompany efforts to strengthen the existing environment and labor provisions in the CPTPP, which is unlikely to garner support from the existing CPTPP members. And so the idea to pursue a digital trade deal instead to re-engage with the Asia Pacific region actually did seem to be a smarter or a more realistic choice of policy rather than a decision to join the CPTPP, which would not only include renegotiating the digital trade provisions, but also all the other provisions in this contained in the CPTPP. Therefore, it remains to be seen if this pillar of digital technology, which is mentioned in the B3W Partnership Initiative, makes its way into a real digital trade agreement with the Asia Pacific countries. And obviously, it includes Korea as well. And so if the US government does indeed pursue a digital trade agreement in the Asia Pacific region, Korea would surely want to be a key partner in this effort. So this is all for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. I'm going to turn it over to Stephen.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be here. And thank you to the Elliott School, as well as the Institute of Korean Studies as well for having me here today. What I'm going to do, because I think a lot of some of the key themes have been touched upon throughout both panels, I'm going to try to reinforce some of the key themes and then introduce sort of an idea about kind of middle power triangulation that would not only be true of Korea, but also many other countries from other regions, ranging from Southeast Asia to Latin America, in terms of trying to situate themselves in this game of competition between the United States and China. Of course, Kirk Campbell this summer, Indo-Pacific coordinator for National Security Council, had highlighted, we all acknowledge that the period that was broadly described as engagement has come to an end. The dominant paradigm now is going to be competition, right? And there's this question then of how does the rest of the world situate themselves around this competition? So what I want to pick up on first is that during the campaign, right, the Biden administration certainly made a lot of overtures about shifting China policy away from a bilateral policy, away from a focus on the trade war, towards multilateralism and towards alliances. And I think to further Ambassador Souter's point about U.S. policy being a work in progress, we're seeing a very incremental move in that direction, right? So we are seeing policy emanating, right, that suggests the importance of these values in terms of multilateralism, right? We have sort of governance issues that are on the table and differences about governance between the U.S. and China. We see sort of ruminations about bringing a WTO case multilaterally against China regarding subsidies in aerospace and airline manufacturing, right? And so you have some incremental movements in that direction. Simultaneously, right? We already see Professor Lee had mentioned supply chains, right? This is really a core way that the United States intends to kind of use its alliances, apparently, as well, right? With sort of this, notion that they would like to diversify supply chains in order to decrease its dependence on China. So we see sort of alliances and multilateralism in that way, but for the most part, we're still kind of stalled in this trade war with China, right? We have phase 1 and phase 2. In phase 1, China pledged essentially to buy $200 billion worth of goods to the United States over 2 years. They've made good about on 2/3 of that, but still have a lot of outstanding progress to be made. But the phase 2, the most difficult stuff in terms of intellectual property right, technology, cyber theft, all these issues is still outstanding, right? And so there's still that question of how does the United States deal with all these issues, right? So in terms of opportunity, right, I think that's where, just to kind of reinforce what Professor Lee was highlighting, that's where Korea's opportunity comes, right? In terms of supply chains, right? We already see coming out of the summit, sidelines of the summit, right? We have the face on some level of economic diplomacy of Korea now ends up being Samsung, LG, SK, Hyundai, right? Investing up to $25 billion in U.S. facilities for manufacturing computer chips for smartphones and electric vehicle batteries as well, right? So we see in this key area where the United States wants to diversify supply chains, using alliances with countries like Korea that has a comparative advantage in this sector to grow U.S. manufacturing. This also aligns with Korea's goals, right? Korea also sort of announced its intention to spend $450 billion in 10-year investment to make South Korea a world leader in the semiconductor industry, right? So you see sort of the complementarities in terms of policy and opportunities for Korea there. That being said, right, I want to then continue the theme that Ambassador Souter also had mentioned earlier about the Korea hedge, right? And I want to develop that just a bit more in terms of, well, why is Korea, hedging to this extent by developing some of the key economic stylized facts that would support this, right? We know that South Korea has longstanding economic ties with China. Well, China is also its largest trade partner, right? A quarter of its exports are sent to China. So certainly has a critical alliance with the United States, but economically, this relationship with China is very key. Even think of this last year, exports surged 45% to a 32-year high in 2021, helping fuel growth this year. And a COVID recovery, export-led COVID recovery, certainly Korea doesn't want to do anything that might jeopardize, right, that. And so hence, that's one reason why you see perhaps this Korea hedge to some extent. I also want to emphasize, during the last panel, there was a lot of discussion of the informal boycott that China had following the THAAD deployment. And Bank of Korea estimated that this unofficial boycott may have shaved as much as 0.4% of Korean GDP in 2017, right? So you can see very clearly that kind of stick. Another example is stick two, when we had Huawei being sanctioned by the United States, there's a question of kind of how Korea would follow from that. China's National Development and Reform Commission gathered technology companies from South Korea and basically indicated them to tread very lightly in this area as well. So you can kind of see the ways that China may use some of this sticks, as Ambassador Souter was talking about. I also, though, want to highlight that they also do have concrete carrots, right? And so South Korea is, we already mentioned the concrete carrot of exports and trade, and that's key to the Korean economy. But also, you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, right, where, of course, Korea has to tread lightly here as well. But there's a lot of economic benefits for Korea to be had in Eurasia, not only in China, but Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and Russia as well. So yes, there's this mix of carrot and sticks. But I think one of the reasons, right, Professor Lee was talking about the importance of the United States, right, and its sort of build back better, right, infrastructure plan globally. Well, one of the reasons it's engaging in this is to directly meet, right, that challenge in terms of the economic benefits that the BRI may offer a lot of countries, including Korea. So with this in mind, I want to just kind of then elaborate on a concept in terms of middle power triangulation, right? Which I think is kind of going on globally, not just with Korea, but with many other countries as well, where it's been a world of economic interdependence as we've known it, right? Since the end of the Cold War in particular, economic interdependence has been the name of the game. So all of a sudden, as right, U.S. and China have descended into this trade war and into this economic competition, the rest of the world's got to figure out what do they do, right? And that's also why I think you get this hedging behavior, not just from Korea, but lots of countries where they need to triangulate this relationship. Why? I think every country is trying to maximize their economic benefits because they're still operating with their knowledge in a world of kind of economic interdependence, maximize the benefits and mitigate potential costs, right? So that may be why, right, at times when China uses coercive tools, right, it ends up being effective, right, because of this primacy that I think a lot of rising powers, middle powers, developing countries give to economics first, right? And so I think in that way, not surprisingly, then we see countries trying to maximize both relationships, right? So Korea very willingly enters into this engagement in terms of semiconductors, research and development, and AI, IT as well, because it offers benefits, right? But where they stand to perhaps be punished, right, economically, they may tread a bit more lightly, right? And it's not only Korea. We see this behavior across the world too. We mentioned Huawei earlier. Take another power like Brazil in a region like Latin America. You had very aggressive efforts of the U.S. government to dissuade Brazil from investing in 5G infrastructure, Huawei's technology, that to a large extent sort of weren't able to dissuade Brazil from doing that, right? And this is someone who, just like Korea, is a very, considered to be a fairly strong ally with the United States, right? And so as a result, you effectively get a very similar situation where Brazil ends up trying to maximize his economic relationship, maybe a little more willing to tread aggressively geopolitically, but also has to be very concerned about its economic ties with China. A country like Brazil that focuses on commodities also, right, has China purchasing a lot of their goods, and they're dependent upon those goods from their export perspective and need those goods to kind of drive their economy, need those purchases of the goods. So all in all, I think what we're talking about in Korea, would also sort of be reflective of a lot of countries throughout the globe. To some extent, unexpectedly 5 years ago or so, plunged into this world of economic competition and trade war between U.S. and China, still operating in a world of economic interdependence and trying to maximize their benefits and mitigate costs. And as a result, they're going to be treading very lightly in the geopolitical and security space. Obviously, you have the military exercises that Ambassador Suter and Professor Kim mentioned before. But nonetheless, my expectation from an economic perspective, because of the concern of potential economic costs, would they continue to triangulate this relationship and try to mitigate their footprint in the geopolitical space.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Those were two extraordinarily interesting presentations. And again, they give a lot to think about. I actually have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask that sort of came to mind. As someone who I'm actually more focused on the diplomatic security issues than I am on trade and technology issues. But one of the things that I often hear talked about is, of course, free trade and the free trade agreements. And it strikes me that one problem that the United States has is that these free trade agreements aren't very popular domestically. And, it's become almost a curse word for a politician to say they support free trade or they support the free trade agreement. So the United States withdrew from the TPP. And most recently, China actually has been trying to get into its replacement, the CPTPP, right? So I'm wondering, I think this is an area that actually concerns me, in that South Korea is very enthusiastic about free trade, not only with the CPTPP, but I believe it's also recently worked on or been working on free trade agreements with Southeast Asian countries. And so there's a lot of enthusiasm for that in the region, but the United States is getting left out because its free trade isn't as popular in the United States, and the United States just isn't willing to commit to it. So I wonder if you could speak about this dynamic a little bit.
Sure, I'll take a cue, a diplomatic cue from Ambassador Sutter, and allow Professor Lee to lead off, if she'd like, as sort of a guest of Elliott School, and then I'll follow up.
So basically, Professor Brzezinski, you're asking about why Korea is so still enthusiastic about FTAs while the US it has a different position with all these changing trade environment and everything. I think that Korea has no choice but to be dependent on free trade and opening up and depending on exports and imports, because its market is very small as compared to the US or the EU. So we are very much highly dependent on exports. 70% to 80% of our GDP are dependent on exports. And so we have no choice but to be enthusiastic about FTAs, which would be the main vehicle for enabling free trade with other countries. So that is the basic difference. And I think that we are actually, the trade people in Korea are quite perplexed by this change in US trade policy, whereas in the past, under the Obama administration, it pushed for TPPP as this main trade tool, trade policy for to represent pivot for Asia. But now it seems to have shifted its policy focus on supply chains, which is a very different dimension, and it seems to be very broader in scope. And it involves many social values and new elements like environment and labor and democratic values that Korea is not really ready to deal with. And so we're still coping with these new developments, these reforms in supply chains, which not only the US is trying to pursue, but also the EU. The EU is working on certain due diligence obligations, making environmental standards and labor standards as an obligatory standard to engage in EU supply chains, which is all very complicated and very new for Korea. And so still, although I think because of these new changes in the trade environment, we're trying to cope with this less focus or less emphasis or less enthusiasm by the US on free trade areas. But still, I think Korea has to be dependent on free trade. And RCEP, I think it's a different story. RCEP is not really a very high standard free trade agreement because it has very low liberalization commitments, because it has China and other ASEAN countries, developing countries. And so I think it's more of a gesture for strengthening the regional economic cooperation or the regional economic integration efforts in Asia. So, but we think CPTPP, joining the CPTPP would be a more significant effort for free trade. But the dynamics currently between US and China, the US not being in the CPTPP at the moment, I think is a very important factor for Korea mulling about when to join CPTPP. And now China having shown its official interest in joining CPTPP, I think is another important factor that's going to make Korean policymakers think about the issue of CPTPP again.
Stephen, do you want to add anything?
Sure. First, I echo Professor Lee's thoughts in terms of market size, right? I mentioned that you have a world that's known economic interdependence, many rising powers, many emerging market countries as a result, who are open and economically interdependent, need export markets, right, to expand the market size, don't necessarily have this large market domestically. So that explains sort of the onus or so much emphasis that's put on trade agreements in a place like Korea, I think, as well. But I'm now going to shift and tack over to U.S. domestic politics, right, which Ambassador Sutter mentioned earlier. I want to develop that a bit more in terms of trade here. I think historically, quite often, the way that economists have thought about trade is sort of the consumption benefits, right, the welfare benefits of trade. Everybody specializes and trades, and that's going to expand the amount of goods that are to offer internationally at cheaper prices, right? And so everybody benefits, but that's from a consumer standpoint. So I think what happened is most of the trade discussion for years often focused on consumption, and the production and job elements of trade, the potential dislocations were known, right? And you had efforts at trade insurance, et cetera, but the saliency was far less. And I think what's happened in the United States in the world of trade, if you look at trade broadly in terms of public opinion, is still, supported by the majority of Americans when it's phrased according to consumption and welfare, right? Even growth to some extent, even globalization. However, when you shift to start talking about wages, production, jobs, that's when it enters into negative territory. So I think what's happened domestically is there's a lot more saliency about the potential losers from trade in terms of production, jobs, and wages. I think this explains to some extent why you get a Biden administration, right, that is supposedly from the campaign going to put the emphasis on multilateralism, right, and the multilateral system in trade and trade deals once again. That's, I think, why you get this emphasis on supply chains. What are they doing with the emphasis on supply chains, right? What is Korea investing in? To some extent, right? Not only telecommunications, right? Not only sort of semiconductor industry, but specifically U.S. manufacturing as well, right? So I think this gets to concerns about the future of U.S. manufacturing and U.S. jobs, right? And so I think because of those domestic audience costs, right, no matter the administration to some extent now, even one that's pro-trade, has to think about how do you grow manufacturing, how do you grow jobs, particularly given the importance for the electoral calendar of Rust Belt states, right? Your Michigans, Ohio's, Pennsylvania's, right? These issues are key in terms of manufacturing, right? And so I think that the saliency of domestic jobs and production has grown. Hence, you get much more of a focus on supply chains, not only to diversify away from China, but also to try to build U.S. jobs and manufacturing as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for those really good comments. I mean, what strikes me is that this move away from free trade towards supply chains also reflects a sort of different U.S. vision of the world, away from globalization towards more of a bipolar international order, where so much of what we do is geared at our competition with China. So I think with this supply chain security, a lot of what, I think the undertone of this is that, well, we need to be secure against China. We're too reliant on China. So we need to sort of shore things up by working with other allies. So that's what strikes me about it. And again, as someone who's not a trade policy expert, but I see I see we're starting to get some questions in the Q&A box. So I'm going to take a few questions from Q&A, and any of the panelists can feel free to jump in and answer these. And I'm gonna take some of the questions, and I'm going to maybe modify them a little bit, or add my own, add a couple of queries that I have about them as well. But we have one question here from Ben Lewis, and of course we've gone through almost an entire panel on U.S. China strategic rivalry and Korea, but we've barely spoken about North Korea at all, and so that's something that's always a factor. So Ben asks, if the threat of North Korea was no longer a factor in South Korea, would its calculus regarding its relationship with the United States change? Would it have as much of an incentive to back the United States against China? And let me just add a little bit to this. Of course, recently, Moon Jae-in has been very intent on pursuing diplomacy with North Korea. And recently, there's even been some new talk and new hope based on statements coming from the DPRK that they might be able to resume these efforts at diplomacy. But of course, China's influence over North Korea is still very, very important. So I'm wondering, how you see, how you see the relationship between South Korea and North Korea, and how does China fit into any kinds of efforts by South Korea to try to achieve, to try to pursue diplomacy with the North? And maybe I'm going to call on Hyunwook to answer that first, if you don't mind.
Yes, China always has been an important player in dealing with North Korea issues. The current Moon Jae-in government, Greg, you know that better than me, maybe, is pursuing to the peace regime in the Korean Peninsula. And China definitely should be the co-signer of the peace treaty if there will be any chances to sign it. But, well, actually, whenever there has been some deals to denuclearize North Korea always preferred a bilateral deal with the United States. When it has been extended to a multilateral forum like a 4-party talk or 6-party talk, North Korea first have a hard time because all other parties came up, gang up, same one voices, which makes North Korea a hard time to get out of it. When North Korea comes up with a bilateral deal, bilateral negotiation with the United States, North Korea has a lot of diplomatic leeway to use between the United States and China. So maybe that's one way that China issue is very important. But I think China North Korea relationship, they're almost like a de facto allies. But North Korea also had some uneasy relationship with China. It's the same way that we have experienced historically. Korean Peninsula and China historically had a hard time being seated right next to China superpower. Historically was not an easy experience. So I think one of the questions that were raised by one of the questioner was, if North Korea threat is not there, maybe South Korea can be more willing to be on the side of the United States against China. I think that's very plausible way to think about. We think that, of course, South Korea thinks of North Korea as a threat traditionally. Of course, recently things has been changed a little bit. But if we are on the position of North Korea, I think I would have a much more hard time to deal with China. Maybe to bandwagon with China or have much cooperation, much stronger cooperation with the United States to deal with China. Now we are South Korea, and North Korea is having a border with China. North Korea is having a very good buffer role, for South Korea against China. So I think in that sense, maybe that's right. Maybe there is a possibility that if there is no North Korea threat, we can have more chance to cooperate, more with the United States. But now the reality is that China, as I mentioned, has been important player it does not want to lose its influence in dealing with North Korea, in denuclearization issues, in peace region formation issues, because the North Korea, now entire Korean Peninsula, has and is important buffer for China to deal with the United States. So it would not lose the Korean influence in the Korean Peninsula, which is situated at the end of the Chinese continent.
Okay, does anybody want to add anything to that?
Yeah,
Okay, go ahead, Bob.
Greg, could I add a thought on this? If I
Sure.
might. We've been talking a lot about the antagonism of the South Korean people to China. That wasn't always the case. 15 years ago, the South Korean people loved China, and they hated the United States. And so that made an element of the alliance between the South Koreans and the United States become even more prominent. South Korea benefits from having this alliance relationship. It's a middle power in a very difficult place in the world. And this gives it clout. They have this alliance relationship. And I think that's something that I remember doing interviews in South Korea 15 years ago on this very issue, and very hostile people to the United States nonetheless told me, we want to keep that alliance relationship because it gives them clout, and they need clout when they deal with big powers. And so this is something that I think that it's just another element that I would add to this equation.
Yes, thank you. And, again, I think China's wolf warrior diplomacy and the carrot and stick approach, it does backfire at times. And I think what you're speaking of is also a dynamic that I was trying to point to earlier, is that, there's a limit to how much China can use these carrots and sticks. And I actually want to pull up a question from the audience as well that sort of touches on this, but pushes it more towards trade. So I'm hoping, I'm hoping Stephen and Hyo-young might have some insights into this. But Andy asks that, is this carrot and stick that China can use diminishing because the economic policy of China is placing a heavier focus and emphasis on domestic growth? And this leads, Chinese-owned enterprises to gain merits based on what they're doing domestically, I would presume, more so than internationally. And I would also just, add another thought I had to this. Does South Korea have any alternatives to China? Is there a way it can build up trade and financial alternatives to China? I know that South Korea is moving into India. It's moved into Southeast Asia very aggressively, or if not aggressively, very proactively. So, how important can these alternatives become to South Korea vis-a-vis its relationship with China? Or is it that, South Korea-China trade partnership inevitably going to be the most important and prominent one? Yes, Stephen.
I'll lead off by talking about China's foreign investment strategy and thinking about sort of the diversified approach that they've really begun to take internationally, beginning with the commodity downturn, right? So when we think of China's investments, we typically think of the large state-led infrastructure financing, right? Which is still the bulk of its investments. But they've also taken this diversified approach where they've also used reserve money to funnel into private equity funds, right? That might invest directly into corporations instead. They take this diversified approach because it leaves them less exposed, right? Interviews, I've done in China historically with bankers talk about, well, that big kind of large infrastructure financing packages, you can end up perpetually restructuring, right? So as a result, we've seen them sort of diversify into other investment tools. Why might this be important in terms of the point about economic coercion, right? Carrots and sticks. Well, when you have these large state finance infrastructure packages, they have features like cross default clauses, something goes wrong with one financing project, they can pull financing from elsewhere. They have funds, right? That, if these loans are securitized by oil or commodities, they have dedicated funds that China gets repaid directly through, right? And so there's all these ways that China, through the state-to-state relationship, can extend benefits, cheap infrastructure finance, but also impose costs. Once they start diversifying the toolkit, which is not only this private equity funds, which are more oriented towards investing directly in corporations in smaller amounts, but also having multilateral partners, right? Some of the multilateral banking institutions. As those institutions move out, even the AIIB tends to use private bidding and procurement, right? More of a transparent system. And they also diversify to have partnerships with other commercial banks internationally, et cetera. As they do those things, those leverage points become more dispersed, right? As you get more partners, as you operate multilaterally, et cetera, right? So the effort to mitigate some of the debt burden from this perpetual restructuring or possibility of perpetual restructuring leads them to have a diversified toolkit, which by the nature of the other tools, they're not going to have the same level of carrots as necessarily or sticks as necessarily previously.
Interesting. Okay, Hyo-young, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I think it's a very good point about China's shift in economic policy, placing more emphasis on domestic growth and the support for SOEs, state-owned enterprises. But this emphasis or growth, state-oriented growth policy, which is where SOEs have a very important position in China's economy, is actually not very new. It's been there for many, many years. And actually, they have been trying to reform SOEs so that they become less dependent and more private capital and more private investment can stimulate the Chinese economy. So this situation, I don't think is very new. But I think because of this, under the Trump administration, this efforts to decouple from China, and not only the US, but under the Biden administration, US and other allied countries are all joining the US in decoupling from China. This is having an effect on Korea as well, because the Moon Jae-in administration has been pursuing this diversification policy to diversify its exports and trade dependence with China, because not only of this dependence problem, but also because of the political economic situations as well. And so we have been pursuing this new Southern policy, which is an emphasis on more better relations with Southeast Asian countries, and also the new Northern policy, which looks into the Eurasia and Russian region as new markets for diversification to replace China and other countries. And mainly because of this changing environment in the RVCs, the GVCs in the Asian region, the regional value chains, and the positioning of China, the change in the position of China in the Asian regional value chain, a lot of the low value added manufacturing have been going to countries like Vietnam and other countries, and they have been serving as alternative manufacturing factories to replace China. And so there has been a lot of shifting of these manufacturing facilities from China to Vietnam. So it has been a policy direction for Korea. But the problem is, will companies actually be able to do that? So still there is a lot of efficiency-based investments, which still value China as an important manufacturing hub. And there are many technologically developed ecosystems established in China. So Korea, even if the government wants to drive its manufacturing facilities out of China, companies cannot afford to do that. So I think it's a policy direction versus the actual reality issue. And so although although from the policy perspective, the Korean government wants to diversify from China and wants to join the US containment policy against China, companies may not be actually be in a very, they may not be quite ready yet to be able to realize that policy direction.
Okay, thank you for that very interesting and good answers. I'm going to shift it back to security issues a little bit now. We have another question from Steve Traver that I think touches a little bit more on security. Steve asks, South Korea is about to launch its newest submarine, which is designed and built by South Korea independent of the United States. Control of the ocean near China is the CCP's biggest concern. How does South Korea justify creating this very expensive capability? So can I call on you, Hyunuk? You need to unmute yourself.
You're asking, the submarine.
Yes, yes.
You mean submarine launched ballistic missiles? Is it what you're
Right.
asking?
I think that he may have been talking about the recent SLBM launch, but it also refers to launching its newest submarine. But I guess might have been referring to the
Yeah.
SLBM.
Yeah, I think it's about. I think the question is about the, SLBM. SLBM. I think South Korea has own leeway to develop its military weapon systems for its own security. Of course, as far as the missiles are related, there were some limits posed by the United States on the. It's not only the South Korea, but MTCL was the multilateral control regime during the Cold War period for the United States to control and limit other countries to develop ballistic missiles, and the U.S. posed limits on the kilograms of warheads and also the the kilometers. South Korea was one of the targets, and also we had a bilateral missile treaty between the U.S. and South Korea to limit the South Korean missile development capabilities. But recently we have removed all that things. No more missile control treaty between the U.S. and South Korea. But as far as SLBM is concerned, I don't think that is under any kinds of control. Any U.S. Control treaty is about the SLBM. The funny thing is that there have been a lot of attempts by North Korea cyber attack on South Korea to capture some of the diagrams and some ways to manufacture SLBMs. I don't know whether they succeeded or not, but I don't think they succeeded, because if they did, they might have developed it earlier than South Korea. So, well, yeah, what can I say more? Yeah.
Right. Very interesting. So I mean, Bob, do you want to add to that?
Just to say, I think the United States wants the friendly countries in the region to be more powerful, economically, politically, and militarily. The United States, to deal with the problems it faces, and particularly the challenges of China, needs allies and partners that are strong. And if South Korea is developing these strengths, I don't see that as a major problem, and I think it's a net asset for the United States going forward.
And I think that was very much how it's been represented. Yanuk, do you want to add again?
Yes. I think Professor Sutter's explanation is right. I think the recent example is formation of AUKUS. I mean, the technology making the nuclear submarine to Australia is one of the examples. But it's said that Japan and South Korea are not the targets of those transfers of technologies. Maybe Japan had its own nuclear policies, 3-no policies, but that's pretty much confined to the nuclear weapons. So maybe Japan might have been the targets of nuclear submarine technology transfer. South Korea, I don't know. Maybe the U.S. might think that South Korea is leaning towards China rather than more than Australia.
Okay. Interesting. So I guess we have time for about one more question, but we are getting close to 10:30. So I'm going to, the answers may need to be a little bit on the brief side. But there's one more question that's sort of relevant to trade. And of course, when you talk about China and its trading partners and how that threatens the United States, there's always been a lot of hype about the Sino-African relationship and Chinese investments in Africa. Tala asks, what are your views on the China-Africa and Korea-Africa trade relationships? You don't hear anywhere near as much about South Korean trade with Africa. Do you think Korea is representing a growing threat to the Chinese presence on the continent and in regards to development initiatives on the continent? Any thoughts about that from our trade experts or panelists?
Let me briefly comment because I don't have a long answer. I don't think Korea has a very large presence in Africa right now, aside from the official development assistance, which I don't think, which I'm not an expert on. And so, but trade relations, Africa is not, because of its geographic distance from Korea and because of this, how do you say, there's less emphasis on the importance of Africa in Korea, I think. So, and Korea is not very much abundant in resource funds to provide Africa with the much needed infrastructure related projects and to meet the needs of the African development needs. And so I don't think Korea is yet perceived as a threat to China in terms of regional dominance. Thank you.
Yes, Stephen.
Yes, I agree with the points about Korea in Africa, and I just want to extend to sort of China's presence in Africa and extend a point that was made earlier as well in terms of China starting to outsource low skilled labor intensive manufacturing, right? Professor Lee had mentioned Vietnam as being sort of a key destination for that. But there are parts of Africa that have played that role as well, such as Kenya. So we do see sort of, people talk about geopolitics in terms of Chinese investments in places like Africa, but we should also underscore that there's geoeconomics here, right? And so some of the manufacturing outsource that's happening is happening in Africa, and it's sort of primarily economic on its surface. Certainly, there's always geopolitics interacted with these things, but we do see some of these economic ties leading the way, right? And commerce leading the way in certain countries.
Right. So I guess, the question might have sort of reflected a little bit of wishful thinking about what people might hope the South Korean role in Africa could be. But honestly, from what I know, I mostly agree with Hyo-young, and unless there's something I don't know. I do see the presence of South Korea's missionaries in Africa is pretty large. And they might be expanding their political and diplomatic presence in other ways, partially as an effort to compete with North Korea. And this has been sort of a long-going theme in South Korean foreign policy. Which Korean state has more legitimacy, more recognition? But I'm going to take Hyo-young's word for it that as an economic presence, South Korea is not very powerful or very influential in Africa right now. So it's 10:30. I want to thank all of our panelists once again for a very stimulating discussion. I would like to thank members of our audience for being here. I hope you enjoyed this GWIKS seminar and that you'll continue to tune in to GWIKS events in the future. And for anybody who is interested in applying to policy-oriented MA programs in Asian studies, do keep in mind, or in any other field, do keep in mind that the deadline for spring admission to the Elliott School of International Affairs is October 1st, this Friday. So if you want to apply for the Elliott School MA program, just a little reminder, we're still accepting applicants for the spring. Okay, thank you very much to everybody.